It seems like there are a number of different linguistically salient types of adjectives. And I guess there are, I think of like count words, color terms, but there are all sorts of different adjectives. What are some of them?
Some types of adjectives. I mean, that would be a project in semantics, right? And one project of modern semantics is to think about the dimensions that would matter for characterizing adjectives. So, like for example, one that's really important to the way people think about adjectives now is gradability. So whether the adjective kind of could be measured along a scale, where prototypically you would say, of course, tall is an adjective that can be measured along a scale, um, whereas nuclear is maybe by default one that is binary. Something is either
Right.
nuclear
Right.
or it isn't. And when you say things like that piece of material is very nuclear, you're coercing it into a gradability that it doesn't have by default. Whereas if you say very tall, that's the normal usage. And then once you have that framework, you start to notice that, for example, tall is different from closed, as in the door is closed, in its scalar properties. And that's plausibly because tall has no bounds at either end, whereas closed has bounds at the lower and upper ends. And that's why it's easy to say things like the door is 2/3 closed, but not Chris is 2/3 tall.
Hmm.
So gradability is this subtle set of characteristics, and actually it goes beyond adjectives. You know, many verbal structures have the same kind of character that you can measure progress. Like Chris mowed the lawn is the kind of activity that you can easily measure because it's got endpoints, whereas Chris ran doesn't really have that property. And then, of course, there are other properties of adjectives, spatial and color, vague, multidimensional. You know, so you might think that wide is pretty unidimensional in its gradability, but beautiful, intelligent adjectives like that are inherently multidimensional. And that leads to a lot of uncertainty about what they communicate. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The scalar adjectives that you mentioned also clearly, maybe they overlap with the vague adjectives, because adjectives like tall are the ones that lend themselves to vagueness and certainly context dependence.
Exactly right. So the linguist reconstruction of that is that for tall, it's vague, and it's vague because you need to take a measurement on the scale of heights. And the standard that you use for saying someone is at or above the threshold is unknown. Like it's set by context, and it's differently set if we're talking about basketball players or cats or linguists or 3-year-olds. And it's differently set even in specific contexts where we're fixed for talking about basketball players. And none of us knows what context we're in, and none of us knows precisely how each of us is going to set the threshold. And therefore, saying Chris is tall is a vague claim. And that has the communicative consequence that I can't use it very precisely in most contexts because I can't expect you to know exactly what threshold I have in mind. I myself might not even know what threshold I have in mind. Yeah.
Mhm. One other question about adjectives that just comes to mind right now, and I don't think that this relates to compositionality, but it certainly relates to the order, because the question is about the order. But I've always wondered why the five big blue houses, for instance, makes sense and sounds right to our ear, but the blue big five houses, or uh, the five blue houses, they just don't. It just doesn't sound right. Is there an answer as to why that is, or why we have these ordering conventions that we do?
Yes, there is outstanding work on exactly that topic led by Stanford linguist Michael Hahn, who just graduated,
Oh, awesome.
Ben Jarafsky, Judith Deegan. They have all worked on this. I would be hard pressed to summarize in an accurate way, but I'll say two things. There's a lot of universality to this, with some interesting cross linguistic variation as well. And to a first approximation, I think you can say that it's going to go from most to least subjective in terms of how you stack left to right as you get closer to the noun. with the ones that are closest to the noun being the ones that are going to be most objectively characterizing of the thing that you're referring to.
Interesting, because I would have thought that five, like the count noun, would be the most objective thing. But when I hear it in my head, the five big blue houses, five comes first.
Yeah, so there might also be some organizing principle around vagueness, but maybe numerical terms are different because they're kind of quasi determiner elements as well. That's the adjective where you could just say five houses,
Uh huh.
the freestanding noun phrase. Yeah, I'd have to check the work, but I think the fundamental thing I want to say is, yeah, like this is a great question for linguists, especially in a department like Stanford, where you might mix together some structural stuff about how noun phrases are organized with some information theoretic stuff about how things tend to get used and what the costs are for speakers and hearers as they process these phrases. And then, of course, you can do the thing that linguists do so well, which is go typological. Don't just look at English. Think about variation in this respect. And there are lots of great resources for this now, and so you can really get a sense for this across the world.
And then returning to uh, this somewhat confused question I asked about innateness of language, when I think you said that there was, well, maybe you can remind me what the phrase was. You said cross linguistic relevance or similarity. What was the term that you used to say that they looked at other languages and found similar orderings or principles?
Yeah, well, just that the principles have a lot of stability across different languages.
Right. I was just wondering, what was it? Cross linguistic stability? Is that the phrase?
That might have been the phrase that I used. I don't know that
Okay.
there's
Okay.
any
But
special
I was
status. But
what
the
I
point would be that these observations you're making about English, you can ask them about any language. And to the point that I think Chomsky might have been making with you, there's a lot of stability that would be surprising if human languages were all just kind of independent of each other and just kind of learned ad hoc by people. The
right.
underlying factors that are guiding this, you could have different theories about that. Chomsky might think that it's just an innate property of the human mind, whereas someone
Yeah.
else might say this is actually a very natural response to, in an information theoretic sense, to the cost of being a speaker and a hearer, and kind of hoping that you build up more information about the referent as you process in a temporal environment, and that would be much more functional and might be much less dependent on you saying that there's like some innate human language module in the brain.
Yeah.
People can differ on these points. Yeah.
Yeah. That's precisely what I was wondering, is how a linguist, when confronted with this cross linguistic stability of a phenomenon, attempts to explain it. Does their work then connect with the evolutionary biologists, the evolutionary psychologists, or are they looking uh, are they looking at the information processing on much more broadly, seeing what's most economical, the ways in which the linguist goes about answering these observations?
Yeah. So I think linguists should be looking at all of those factors. You know, language impacts essentially every aspect of our cognitive and social lives. And so it would be foolhardy to think that you could somehow isolate it from everything else. Um, and so I think it's a process of just figuring out, like, for example, the stock of color terms that we have in English is definitely partly guided by aspects of the color system, and it's definitely also guided by aspects of how English is used and its history and its evolution in that sense. It's also guided by the fact that we live in an industrial society where many things are artificially colored, and the way we differentiate them is by their color. And if we lived in an environment with many fewer manufactured things, color might not be a salient dimension, and therefore we might have fewer color terms. That's
Mm-hmm.
not going to say something deep about the language or the people who use it. It says something probably about the environment in which they live. And to
Yeah.
leave out that aspect of your account of language, again, as I say, just seems foolhardy.
And it's also, maybe I missed it if you mentioned it, but it's quite constrained by the human visual system.
Absolutely, that's got to be a factor. Yeah, so it would also be foolhardy to say that you can explain this entirely by the structure of noun phrases or entirely by the fact that we have a lot of manufactured goods. That's also obviously incorrect. And so that's what makes linguistics exciting to me, is that essentially every account you give needs to draw on all of these aspects of cognitive science and social life. And
Hmm.
the only thing I resist is this urge that some linguists seem to feel to give very narrow accounts. And Chomsky is the chief promulgator of the narrowest sort of accounts.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, his feeling is that you could explain language entirely as essentially syntax, and that the only thing that is of interest to you as a linguist is the kind of internal abstract mental competence that you have. And so at best, I think he would say that the influence of like industrialized society or the human color system on the shape of color terms is boring and irrelevant, and that
Now,
it's not the project of linguistics. And I am telling you that that is just wrong.
mhm. So, two observations. One, I'm noticing a major similarity between your view of linguistics and my view of philosophy, in that it seems like you think they're both subject. Well, you think about this about linguistics. I think about it as philosophy, is that they're at their best when they are in dialogue with other disciplines. So you mentioned earlier, philosophers of language need to be in much closer dialogue with linguists doing empirical work. And it sounds like, from your perspective as a linguist, the linguist needs to be in dialogue with the psychologist, the cognitive scientist, the evolutionary biologist.
We're probably alike in that deeper abstract sense that I would guess that neither of us really believes that the world is kind of divided up neatly into categories, and
Yeah.
that redounds into everything, including scientific disciplines. And so the idea that you could be obsessively just a philosopher of mind or a philosopher of physics without thinking about every other aspect of philosophy is just going to steer you wrong. That is absolutely my position about linguistics. There is no clear dividing line between any of the concepts that I've mentioned. And that means that if you want to give satisfying accounts, you probably need to draw on all of them all at once. Yeah.
And then the second thing I wanted to ask is just a point of clarification. I understand that Chomsky is thought of as one of the founders of cognitive science, and not just contemporary linguistics. And just knowing that, it doesn't seem to uh, jive or vibe, to use today's vernacular, with the description you just gave of him preferring this very narrow approach to language. He seems very interested in the human mind and its capabilities, and not just syntax and grammar and this sort of thing.
As always with Chomsky, it is all of that all at once, and you have to embrace all of those contradictions. You have to say that Chomsky is absolutely one of the most important figures ever in cognitive science, and certainly a founding element of it, and also maybe done more than anyone to hold it back. You have to accept that he is the source of most modern thinking about language, especially the things that we now regard as central, like how do people acquire language, and the mundane things being the most illuminating things as a guiding principle. So nobody has done more for linguistics, but also nobody has done more to hold linguistics back by being incredibly narrow about what you count as linguistics, and basically arguing that it should be insulated from psychology and computer science and cognitive science. You have to be willing to say these things all at once. Chomsky is the driving force behind the explosion of linguistics departments that happened in the 60s and 70s in the US. And also, I think, a primary reason why that has plateaued. You have to
Mhm.
say all these things all at once with Chomsky.
This is so fascinating to hear as an outsider, somebody who doesn't really know much about the world of linguistics. Very
You
cool.
have to say, like, so here's a wonderful example that I think really speaks to the brilliance of Grice. So Grice was inspired by Chomsky in the sense that Chomsky was giving these kind of compact, abstract descriptions of syntax. And Grice said, I want to do the same thing for social interaction involving language, for communication. But Grice did that at a time when Chomsky was going around saying that the study of semantics was hopeless and pragmatics would be just beyond the pale in terms of actually being a scientific discipline. Grice had to see through all of that bluster and find inspiration in Chomsky. So even as Chomsky was being as negative as you can be about the field, he inspired Grice in this way, and the rest is history.
Hmm.
So we have Chomsky to thank for pragmatics, but boy, you could find lots of quotes where he essentially says no one should study pragmatics. I think it's the same for semantics. Formal semantics is very Chomskyan in its kind of outlook, even though throughout the 60s and 70s, Chomsky was saying semantics is not part of linguistics.